Hey guys, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I'm going to be letting you know just what is this mystical sandbox that Wargaming have been talking about recently, why it could make or alternatively break the future of World of Tanks, and highlighting the key outcomes from a question and answer session that myself and other contributors had straight with the developers. So firstly, you might be asking, just what is World of Tanks Sandbox? Well, the idea is to provide a link between the small number of super testers that Wargaming have and the public test server, where that pretty much is what goes into the game next patch. The Sandbox server is going to be a testbed for Wargaming to gather statistics and feedback, with careful selection to the players who can participate on this Sandbox server to provide meaningful feedback. And Slava Makarov, who is the R&D operations director, said it is like a sandcastle where they can quickly build it, break it down again, make changes, and if they didn't like what they originally built, rebuild it entirely differently. So now I'm going to give you some of the highlights from a conference that we had with Stanislav Kargin and Yuri Filipovsky. Both are within the game balance side of things at Wargaming. So firstly, is the Sandbox Test Server permanent? The answer was yes, the Sandbox is planned to be permanent, but Balance 2.0 is a pilot and they have to see whether it goes well or not. Next, will a Sandbox tester's account be synchronized to the Sandbox server, and will progress they make on the Sandbox server then be applied to their live account? Progress from the Sandbox server is not going to be saved on the live server, so that players don't have to worry about winning and losing, maybe losing credits, or even affecting their statistics in their favorite vehicles, thus allowing Sandbox testers to effectively play how they want to. So next, how many players are needed for testing, and is there going to be a schedule of the tests? Wargaming's answer is there isn't going to be a fixed number of Sandbox testers, but their goal is to have 5,000 people on the server at all times. And so if they find that they're not getting enough people on the server, I guess they'll be pushing out more and more invites. And the initial plan for a schedule of the Sandbox server is they're going to be releasing one patch weekly. So next, if Wargaming are planning on getting 5,000 people to play continuously on a Sandbox server and their account progress is not going to be advanced, how are they going to incentivize them to play? Wargaming feel that the invitation to the Sandbox server will be enough to maintain these numbers, and there are no rewards, no incentives for playing on it apart from that you get to test World of Tanks and be able to provide hopefully meaningful feedback. Next, a question that I'm sure you'll all be asking: what are the criteria for Sandbox testers? Wargaming's answer was that the main criteria is that players must have at least one tier 10 vehicle, but subsequent tests might have different requirements. And one thing that should be noticed is they highlighted that participation in the first Sandbox test does not necessarily mean that you're going to be able to participate in future Sandbox tests. So next, it was asked how many tiers will be on the test server. Well, in the first iteration it's all going to be tier 10, but then they will progress to 9 and to 8. And so on and so forth all the way down the tiers. Now, the idea of this from Wargaming's perspective is that they want to do what they call horizontal balancing inside each tier. And then once they feel that they've got each tier balanced, then they'll move on to the next tier and the tier after that. Then after they've done all of these different layers of what they call horizontal testing, then they're going to try and balance between the tiers with vertical testing, which sounds like a fairly logical approach to balancing what must be an absolute nightmare to try and get your head around. Next, it was asked why balance from the top to the bottom rather than from the bottom to the top. Wargaming's answer was that the game lacks endgame content outside of the global map, and they want to give players more chances to use their tier 10 vehicles in battle and more diverse options. Next, one of the contributors asked whether there's going to be an NDA of the Sandbox server, i.e. a non-disclosure agreement, which would prevent all participants from sharing their information to other players. Wargaming was not sure whether there would be a non-disclosure agreement of the Sandbox server and that they would have to ask publishing that. But from my perspective, as somebody who's really hoping that he gets to participate in the Sandbox test server and wants to share all of my experiences with you guys, I truly hope that Wargaming doesn't put an NDA on it, so the community as a whole sees the development of a game that we all enjoy and love, right? So next, are the changes that will be implemented on the Sandbox server significant gameplay changes, or are they focused balances? Wargaming's answer is that Balance 2.0 has already been tested and it is now in pre-release, and the Sandbox server will test global rebalances, testing large theoretical changes rather than small buffs and nerfs to individual tanks. So effectively, we're going to see dramatic changes on the Sandbox server, such as maybe revisiting the view range mechanics in the game, rather than, for example, increasing the rate of fire of the E-50M or thinning the armor on the Japanese heavy tanks. Next, it was asked, is the Sandbox an experimental test server? And if so, how will you take steps to ensure that players know that content may never reach the game? Now, the developer's answer here was very interesting, at least for me, and that is that their aim is for 70% of the content that is on the Sandbox server to hit the test server. But they say that it's up to publishing to ensure that players know that everything is subject to change, and things that we see on the Sandbox server might never hit the test server. So next we have a series of rather specific questions. Firstly, will self-propelled guns still be able to penetrate paper tanks like the Borsig or vehicles without a roof? And what about experience earnings? Are they going to be reworked too? Wargaming's answer was yes, high explosive shells penetrating low armored tanks are still going to do large amounts of damage, and that is the role of self-propelled guns. And their idea is they're going to tweak experiences to reward additional actions while also keeping the overall experience gained the same. So I was thinking to myself, what additional actions could they be thinking of? Could they be trying to implement that tanking experience coefficient again, i.e. when you block damage or take damage that you actually earn experience? Next up, how extreme will you be with the testing to the matchmaking systems, such as +1 -1 matchmaking? Wargaming's answer was very clear here, no, we will not test +1 -1. Next, it was asked whether leaked statistics that certain sources had been providing to the community were real. Wargaming answered by saying that the leaked data was from a very early stage of hypothetical testing, that they should wait to see when the Sandbox server comes out how much of that was retained. Next, one of the most interesting questions and answers, and that was whether Wargaming were planning on making changes to premium ammo. The developers answered by saying that all ammo will be changed on the Sandbox server, and that premium ammo usage on the Sandbox test server will be limited to encourage a more varied ammunition loadout. Next, it was asked whether there would be changes to the RNG in the game, i.e. the +25, -25% rolls. Wargaming said that they are planning on adjusting the high explosive shell damage and other small tweaks, but RNG will not be changed. Next up, a question that a lot of you older players might be thinking about. What has happened to this idea of national features, like German tanks being the best snipers, or that Soviet tanks had ridiculously high alpha damage? Something that certainly has been blurred, at least of recent dates. The developers answered that while originally nations had overall features, tanks are now adjusted on a per vehicle basis rather than how they fit into a nation's ethos. And finally, one of the most obvious questions, how will players of the Sandbox test server provide feedback? So the idea is that community managers will post all the feedback from the forums, and that Wargaming support also has a separate system for the Sandbox test server to then direct them in the correct way quickly, and that questions will also be sent to the email of the Sandbox test servers where they can reply directly. And that was the end of the conference. So my overall impression of what Wargaming are going to be doing with the Sandbox test server is that they want to test things that they have on the super test with a very small number of players with a much larger and focused fan base. But the problem with the test server is that Wargaming have effectively made it feel like what goes on the test maybe changed a tiny little bit, but it's going to go into the game. And so effectively, Wargaming are doing something rather smart by creating this intermediary test server, because if they'd released gigantic changes on the regular test server that we all play on, all of the player base would have thought, oh, this is definitely going into the game, and I expect there would be mass panic. One thing that I feel that the Sandbox server further proves, and it's this idea that Wargaming have had this paradigm shift in their development plans. Previously, in between about 2011 to 2014, Wargaming just kept churning out tank after tank after tank after tank. And as players, we were absolutely lapping it up. And then I think that they had this bit of a down period in 2014 and 2015, where the amount of tanks that a player could possibly ever try and get in the game became saturated, and in patch 9.13, 14 and 15 we've seen these kind of game enhancements. And now in the second half of 2016, Wargaming have effectively created a testbed to try and make rather large dramatic gameplay changes to World of Tanks. And I personally think that this is now going to be a sink or swim moment for World of Tanks. Now that Wargaming have stopped churning out vehicles in the game, you've lost those interested players. And churning out tank after tank was just so safe because everyone loved the game already, right? It was a tried and tested method, but now they're going to make dramatic gameplay changes. It's going to be based on theories and effectively designers and developers. So I guess we've all just got to sit here crossing our fingers hoping that they make the right choices, and World of Tanks will continue rolling out. And so that sums up everything from the conference and what I think and know about Sandbox so far. And basically, we just gotta wait and see. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving it a like down below. It really helps the channel out. And also, let me know in the comments everything that you think about Sandbox. I'm sure it's gonna be a very interesting section. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.